something special that I wanted to say to you tonight. We have somebody quite special here who often helps us with everything that we need. And he's my son-in-law. And it happens to be the week of his birthday. This isn't his birthday, but this is the week of it, and that's near enough. Because I didn't even get any of it last year for him. And so now I'm going to do it big with all of you included. And I feel so grateful for the way that he is helping to carry on the school and have people know about it and know what it's like and remember it. And other people have helped keep it in the legal parts so that it'll stay. And of course, to me, that's just coming home. So I love it. And is everybody in?
Yes. There's seats up here.
Okay.
No, Aunt Dottie will tell me.
She just said,
Are you ready, Aunt Dottie?
Yes.
We are going to sing Happy Birthday to Bud and Aunt Dottie. This is one of her original designs. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Bud. Happy birthday to you.
And
Bring it around.
Can we bring it around so people
Yeah, sure, but look at that. I think that's Aunt Dottie. Isn't that your design, Aunt Dottie?
Yes.
it's not my design.
Look at that. Look at that. It's gorgeous.
Oh, that's
Look at this. Glen Historical Society. Great. I know, there's anything else, Aunt Dottie? Are we good?
We're good.
Should we cut it, need it, or should we have the?
No, we gotta do one more. We got a program to do.
Well, it was more serious not work, she knew.
Pardon?
She's not worried, she knew that it was going to be interrupted, our speaker.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, wait, and we got the plates.
Okay,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
the bell.
Okay,
Wilson.
new business.
Sorry about that.
Well, I can't say that was a pleasure, but it was certainly an interruption. First, I have to do my commercial, I guess. We have steamboat books again available. And we have the last old, so this will be a true memento. So if you don't have one of these, here's the very last one. And the new one has the same contents but a different cover. And they're Charlie Cooper's books. Charlie did a program here many years ago. He's one of the Pines people, the grandson of, can't remember. Anyway, the guy who started Solvay Process and bought the whole Pines complex. We also have a few more of these left. They're also becoming collector's items because the cat's meow is no longer in business. So if you don't have one. And then we just got a new bunch of re-echoes. So we have, I think, about 45 to 45. And when they're gone, we don't know what we will do. Maybe we will never reprint this. So another one. Tonight, we also have another.
Wait, you missed one thing.
I'm sorry.
I just have to go get them.
When we say commercial interruption, we
really need it.
the lights don't
What else
come
are
on
we-
by
oh, yes, oh,
themselves,
yes.
folks.
We are also selling postcards, colorized postcards of Glen Haven. These are $2.50 apiece, and we get half the money, I think.
Yes, and
Okay.
there are 5 different scenes.
There are 5 different scenes.
Wonderful.
The stagecoach coming down the hill, the dock at Glen Haven, the Ceylon store, the Glen Haven Hotel, and I think that's it. Oh no, stagecoach in front of the hotel. So if you don't have a postcard, those are also in limited
They are
supply.
very limited supply.
Yeah.
This will only be a one-time print.
Okay, but we have a very special guest here who will be introduced only at this point, so pay attention. We have the great grandson of Josiah Letchworth with us, and he's in the back, and he said he's deaf and he won't be able to hear anything I say, but I'm trusting him. Anyway, Josiah was William Pryor Letchworth's youngest brother. Is that right? Youngest. And so that makes Hayden the great nephew of William Pryor Letchworth. So anyway, it's an honor to have a Letchworth with us. But the more famous person is his wife. The spouse has priority. Tonight's speaker is Lenora Brown Letchworth. Lenora is a graduate of Nazareth College, where she earned a degree in art history. She served as assistant to the director of museums with the Landmark Society of Western New York in Rochester from 1982 to 1994, during which time she was assigned to interpreting the Campbell-Whittlesey House and the Stone-Tolan House Museums. In 1995, Leonora had the privilege of accepting a special assignment at the Susan B. Anthony House and another project with the Leroy Historical Society in Leroy. From 1995 to 97, she served as director of the Tinker Homestead Museum in Henrietta. In 2000, she moved to the Hudson Valley and accepted the position of Historic Sites Administrator at Knox's headquarters, State Historic Site, an adjunct to Washington's headquarters, and the New Windsor Cantonment? Cantonment, okay. She'll tell us what that is later. In 2001, she returned to Western New York as a curator of the William Pryor Letchworth Museum at Letchworth State Park. She retired from Letchworth in 2011 and married Hayden Letchworth, great-nephew of William Pryor Letchworth. Hayden and Leonora live in Ithaca, where they concentrate on the care and organization of a vast collection of Letchworth family archives. Tonight, the title of Leonora's talk is William Pryor Letchworth, It's a Legacy.
So I hope I have all this equipment on me properly. The New Windsor Cantonment is the place where George Washington had, what do I want to say, presented the very first Purple Heart medal. And it was actually made of fabric. And it was, I think it was worked on, embroidered and so forth by Martha Washington. So the cantonment was a place where they drilled and the soldiers were there and they had balls and they did all the kind of military things that the soldiers did in the American Revolution. But enough of that, because I'm here to talk about this fellow here. And first I want to ask you, how many of you have visited Letchworth State Park? Raise your hand if you've been there. And how many of you have been there since 2006? Because in 2006 was the preparations for our centennial, 100 years as a park. And all the exhibits now are new and updated exhibits. That's when I changed all the exhibits in the museum. So if you haven't been there, you should definitely go back. William Pryor Letchworth was the man who gave the park, and he gave the park to the people of the state of New York. Sometimes the state of New York forgets that it belongs to the people, I think. But He was a very amazing self-made man. He was a Quaker. He was president of a large and successful company in Buffalo. And as a very young man, he decided that he was going to make his fortune first, and then he was going to spend the rest of his life after he retired at the age of 50. He was going to spend the rest of his life doing social reform work. So I think we should have the next slide now. This is the house at Sherwood, New York. I assume everybody knows where Sherwood, New York is, pretty much. It's between Cayuga Lake and Owasco Lake, and it's near, if you go to Aurora and come right out Sherwood Road, you'll come to Sherwood. It's Four Corners, and there's a wonderful museum there called the Howland Stone Store Museum, which you should all visit sometime if you have a chance. And these are his parents, Anne and Josiah Letchworth. They were Quakers, and they came from Burlington, New Jersey about 1820. They settled in Brownville, New York. And they settled there for a while in the Black Creek country of Brownville. And then they moved south to Moravia. And they stayed in Moravia for a few years. And then they moved to Sherwood. About 1830, we moved to Sherwood. Josiah was a harness maker, and he supported 8 children on what he earned as a harness maker. He did a few jobs on the side, like bookkeeping and so forth. Next slide, please. This is a book that is in Mr. Letchworth's collection, and it was printed in 1830, and it was his very first book, the very first book that he owned himself. And it was a wonderful thing for him, because books to the Quakers are very, very important. Education is very important. And so for him to own that book was wonderful. And I've got to find the quote so that I can read what is written on there, because it's hard to read. He was 7 years old when he received this book from his father as a Christmas gift, and the inscription reads, William Pryor Letchworth, a present from his father, 12th month, 25th day, 1830. It's Peter Carley's Juvenile Tales, and they were a series of short moral tales that were designed to impress young minds with a sense of justice, tolerance, and personal responsibility. There were several colorful illustrations throughout the book, and this one shows 3 naughty children stealing the bird's nest with the little baby robins in it. And there was a lesson to be learned about that. So one of the stories was about that. Years later, William wrote opposite his father's inscription, this is the first book I ever owned, and it was the foundation of my library. William Pryor Letchworth. When Mr. Letchworth died, his library held over 1,000 books, and some of them were written by himself. Next slide, please. And here's the family. There were 8 children, divided equally among boys and girls, which was very equitable. William was born in 1823, and he was born in Brownville, New York. Brother George was born in 1827. Edward was born in 1821, and Josiah Jr. was born in 1836. They all eventually worked for Pratt and Letchworth, and Pratt and Letchworth was the company that William started in Buffalo. Next slide. And these are the girls. Marion Crozier was the oldest, and she was widowed twice. She never had any children, but she raised a cousin. She had an uncle who had 12 children, and they were very poor. And she took one of the girls and raised her as her own daughter. And she also helped to educate and raise her own sister, Hannah. So she was a very important person in the family. And next to the mother, Anne Hance Letchworth, she was probably the second in command. Charlotte Smith was the youngest of the daughters. She had 3 children, and I don't know why her 3rd child isn't shown in this photograph. I still haven't figured out why. But the little boy graduated from Yale University and had a degree in medicine. And the daughters both married missionaries, and one of them wound up living in Puerto Rico. Eliza Hoxie was the 2nd oldest daughter. Eliza lived in this area. She lived near Genoa, and she married a Hoxie, and her husband's name was Zebulon Hoxie. And I wish I had a picture of him because he looks like his name was Zebulon. He has this great big beard. She raised 8 children, and one of her, and even though they were Quakers, her son Alan died in the Civil War in 1864. And we have in our collection, we have a wonderful letter that he wrote about how he decided as a Quaker that it was all right to fight in the Civil War and what he was fighting for. And Hannah Howland, it was the youngest daughter who was taken over by Marion Crozier. She was taken to Philadelphia to be finished. And when she was finished, she came back home and married a very into a very prominent family in Sherwood, the Howland family. Her husband William they were quite wealthy, bankers, and William became a New York State assemblyman, and so she's a very talented lady. Next slide, please. Oh, now I'm going to have to find another quote. The Letchworth family had a habit of writing letters to which all the members in the family could see. They could all read. Sometimes they would get a letter from William, and they would copy the letter to practice their handwriting, and then they would send William's letter to the next sister or brother, and that's how they all kept up with the news. They didn't have email back then. And so William, at a young age, probably about 13, he got very upset about, he didn't seem to think he was ever going to be able to live up to some of the heroes he read about in his books. And so he decided that the best way to become a hero like the ones in his books was to run away from home. So he was all set to run away from home, and his parents found out. Somebody snitched on him and told his father that he was going to run away from home. And so his father had a talk with him and said, well, you know, your mom's knitting some really nice socks for you, and I know your sisters have got some presents that they're working on for you, and we're really going to miss you, and we really wish you wouldn't go away, but if you've got to go, you know, it's your decision. Well, after he got through telling him about all the benefits of staying at home, he decided not to go. But he wrote to his sister, Marion Crozier, and asked her, this is what the quote is. William had a letter written some time ago asking thy advice respecting what course he should take in life. He seems to have no definite object in view. I feel a deep interest in his welfare, but I'm at some loss to know what to do with him. He doesn't seem to be fond of my business, a harness maker. I have some doubts as to his following a trade, even if he learns one. His work in the shop is all nice and neat. There is not one of us can stitch better than he can, or write better than he can, or speak a piece better than he can. Yet with all this, either from the fact that his prospects in life are not congenial to his taste, or some other cause, he moves slowly. The energies of his mind do not seem to be enlisted. So, next slide. William took his father's letter to heart. I think it must have just broken his heart to read that, but. So he set himself down and he wrote out rules of conduct. He decided that was a good place to start. He was going to rise at 6, eat breakfast at 6:30, dinner or lunch 12:30, supper at 6:30, retire at 9:30, attend divine service once every Sunday, tell the truth under all circumstances if it's necessary to speak. Never wound the feelings of others if it can be avoided. Strive to be always cheerful. Every night review the actions of the day and apply them to the test of my conscience. I like that one. In business affairs, keep in mind that procrastination is a thief of time, and time is money. His mother, that was her favorite one. Be temperate in all things. Strive to speak kindly without giving offense, always with coolness and deliberation, having due regard for the views of others. Aim at a high standard of character, attempt great things and expect great things, and aim to do all possible good in the world, and so live as to live hereafter and have a name without reproach. I think that's pretty good. I think everybody should live like that today. Next slide, please.
I'm with you, Dave.
So here is this young man, and he's on his way to become a millionaire, he decides. And he's going to follow his discipline, he's going to live by his rules, and become very wealthy, and then he's going to be able to do social reform, items of social reform. And this is a picture of him when he arrived in Buffalo. But before he arrived in Buffalo, his father apprenticed him when he was 15 years old to a harness maker in Auburn. It was called Hayden and Holmes. Hayden Holmes was the company. And they actually imported saddlery, and they repaired carriage hardware, and they repaired harness, and they made saddles, and they did all kinds of, carriage hardware is what they sold mostly. And that was their business, and they did a lot of importing, exporting, and it came through New York City. So he worked there for about 7 years, and then he was promoted to New York City to work. Next slide, please. After he had worked in New York City, he made the acquaintance of the Pratt brothers in Buffalo. Samuel Pratt and his brother Pascal Pratt were real wheelers and dealers up there. In later years, Pascal Pratt became one of the founders of the M&T Bank. So they had their fingers in everything. But they really liked William Letchworth because they had done business with him, and he was honest, and they liked his style. So they decided to offer him a full partnership in their business. And this is from the Buffalo City Directory, about 1856, I think. And it shows the building where his store was, and the kind of things they had to offer, best Norway nail rods, stuff like that. And then up on the 4th floor, he had bachelor quarters over the store. And there are diaries and letters from his sister saying how she would go up to Buffalo and shop at Pratt and Letchworth, and thought, what on earth could she buy there? Well, apparently she could buy anything she wanted practically. Especially they like to make a lot of Japan ware, and it was very popular then, and fancy little tea trays and things, alongside the nails and all the other stuff that they sold. Next slide. And in 1865, his little business had become the Buffalo Malleable Ironworks and Steel Foundry. And this is 1906. This is what the plant looked like in the inside in 1906. And this is, I think it's a little bit exaggerated, I don't know for sure, but that's supposedly what the plant looked like. And he was in charge of 200 men at one time. Next slide. Then he apparently got sick. I'm still trying to figure out what happened to him, because his sisters went to visit him in Buffalo and see how he was doing. And from that handsome man that you just saw a little while ago, he turned into this very frail, kind of skinny, sad-looking fellow. And they said that he grew the beard because of something that happened to his face. And they said his face looks much better than it did. So I don't know if he had smallpox or what, but he grew a beard to cover it up. And then his sister, Marion Crozier, had been telling him for years that he needed to get some social life under his belt because all he was doing was working. And so he decided at this point to take a trip in 1856. He was going to take the Grand European Tour that is important for anyone, any gentleman who wants to be fully educated in 1856. Next slide, please. When he came back from his trip to Europe, and unfortunately his father died while he was in Europe, so that was pretty sad. But when he came back, he took his sister's advice, and one of the things he did to get a social life was to join the Buffalo Fine Arts Academy. And he actually raised a lot of money to save that academy, and it became the Albright Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo. That was the beginning of it, and he was president of the academy for, I think, 5 years. But they couldn't raise money. All these artists and writers, they didn't know how to raise the money, so they needed him. And he came in and he talked to Mr. Albright, and Mr. Albright, he convinced him to give $3,000, which back then was a lot of money. So that was one of the things that he did for socialization. Next slide, please. Then another thing that he felt he needed, was a place in the country. Because before this, he had been living on the 4th floor of the store. He'd been living in boarding houses all over the city. And when he didn't have a room in a boarding house, he would go and live with his brother Edward. So by this time, all the brothers were in Buffalo working for Pratt Letchworth. And in 1858, he took a trip on the Erie Railroad, and someone told him that you have to get off the train when you go over the bridge that you're not supposed to walk on. And you look over the side and look at the view. This was a big thing to do in these days. And the bridge was completely made of wood. It was like wood sticks all put together. And so he's up there, and they did actually have a walkway. And they also had stairs that went down, and you could walk under the railroad tracks and go across the gorge. And even ladies in long skirts, we have pictures of them going across there. And this is what it looked like at that time. It looked pretty rough. That's not the greatest photograph in the world, but it's the best we could do for 1858. Next slide, please. And this is what if you've been to the Glen Iris, this is what his lawn looked like back then when he found the property. It was the lumbering companies had come in, and they had denuded many of the acres of land in the area of trees, and there were just tree stumps everywhere. And you can see the wooden bridge that was probably built with those trees that were taken out. And they had a mill on the river near this is the Middle Falls here. And they had just piles of wood all over. You know how men are. They just have to have it all over the place. So, next slide, please. But he saw this, and here's some more of the beautiful. They had this little bridge that you could walk across, but it was taken out with a flood in 1864. So then, to get across, you had to go on the railroad tracks, pretty much, unless you want to take the long way around. But now the lumber is piled a little more neatly, but all this had to go. And Mr. Letchworth stood there looking at this mess, and just then a rainbow appeared over the falls, which happens about every 5 minutes. But he knew that was a sign, and he had to have this. This was a sign from God, and he had to have this. So he started purchasing the property. And of course, when a wealthy man starts purchasing little farms, all the prices go way up. So just the story of getting the property is a whole chapter in itself. But next slide, please. He did get it. He got the property, and he began cleaning up, and he started inviting his literary friends out from Buffalo. He also was a member of a club called the Nameless. They didn't know what to name themselves, so they called themselves the Nameless. And the Nameless Club was made up of young men and women who were painters, writers, poets, musicians, all kinds of talents. And I like to think that this is some of them walking around here on the grass. And this is a really gorgeous photograph of the falls in the period of just before the Civil War. Next slide, please. He invited his family to come too and stay. This is the Glen Iris. This is his home. In the beginning, what it looked like. He actually raised the roof and put a 3rd story on it eventually. And this canoe was given to him by a friend. It was a real birch bark canoe, and now it's in about 103 pieces in the basement of the museum. We priced getting it fixed, and we found a guy who thought he could fix it. He does the work down in North Carolina, but it would cost $10,000 to fix that and put it all back together. But anyway, he had a landscape designer come out. His name was William Webster, and William Webster designed the city cemetery in Ithaca, which I'd like to go and see, but there's no place to park up there, so I can't get in it. Anyway, so he designed this landscape, and you can see there's a rustic bridge going over this little stream, and even today there's a pond there with goldfish in it and a fountain spitting up out of the water. And it was a beautiful place, and his brothers all immediately started looking for a country place of their own, and they copied a lot of his ideas. There's a place in Moravia. His brother George owned Meadowbrook Farm in Moravia, and it was apparently a grand place, but it's mostly gone now. But the area where they had a pond like this, and if you have a reservoir of water up high and you can force it down and through a pipe, it'll go up like that. So George had that in his place in Moravia, and Josiah had that same thing in place on Owasco Lake. So they copied him. Next slide. In 1875, 1876, Marianne and Mr. Letchworth's cousin Lil came to live with him and keep house for him. And this is what the house looked like then. Marianne died there in 1893, but she lived there for almost 20 years. And her mother had just passed away, and she was widowed twice. So apparently back then, I don't know, after your husband dies, everybody else gets the money and you have to go find a place to live. It seems like that's what happened. But she came and kept house for him. And this fellow on the lawn was Mr. Letchworth's official photographer. And he was also the town, he owned didn't own it, he was the leader of the town band in Castile, New York. But thanks to him, we have wonderful photographs, stereo views, most of them, of Mr. Letchworth's house. Some other people who lived in the house were his dog Caesar, who was an English Mastiff dog, and Tiger. And the lady is Mary Ryan. Mr. Letchworth had several young ladies who, most of them were immigrants from Ireland, Switzerland. They would come and keep house and help keep house with his sister. And there were 3 dogs named Caesar, and they're buried in various places in the park. I don't know, I haven't found any of their graves, but they were very much loved. And we have a bill for $100 for dog biscuits for Caesar. Next slide. So Mr. Letchworth, by the time he was 50, was rich enough to retire, and his brothers took over the business, and he was appointed to be a commissioner on the Board of Charities, New York State Board of Charities. That's just what he wanted to do. And in order to keep his nose clean and his reputation above reproach, he refused to accept a salary. So he worked without a salary for 27 years for the state of New York. And his job was to be commissioner over the 8th Judicial District, which was Buffalo, the Buffalo area, western New York. And he traveled around and inspected poorhouses, county homes, jails, mental facilities, mental hospitals, orphanages. And it was a really sad time because there was no real safety net. If your county couldn't afford an orphanage, you might wind up living in the jail. If you were an orphan and you had no place to go and you had no family, and that happened a lot. And if you were mentally ill, people had to figure out a way to take care of you, to protect you from yourself and other people. And so there was a lot of that kind of situation going on where there was a disparity between counties and towns of what kind of facilities they had. And that was something he wanted to fix. Next slide, please. When he was working in New York City, that was 1845, he would see these children, homeless children living on the streets. Little girls were working as prostitutes. little boys were working as prostitutes. They would do anything for food. Sometimes their parents would just shove them out the door because they had more children than they could feed or take care of. And if they were 10 or 12 years old or even younger, they had to go out and find a way to feed themselves. And so this is a photograph that was from one of the books that Mr. Letchworth wrote on what he called his project of child saving. And these were dependent children. And they were as dependent on the charity of their fellow men as the persons who were mentally ill were. There was no treatment. There was no way to fix these problems. So that was his first thing. He wanted to set up foster homes for children in Buffalo, take the children out of the orphanage as soon as possible, get them into a family situation. And he felt that was going to solve the problem. But of course we know it doesn't always solve the problem. Next slide, please. Here's one of the, this is the Randolph, New York home for children, for orphan children. And it looks very nice and clean and neat and tidy, but I don't know why the children, little toddlers, are sitting on the roof over here. With just one lady maybe she's got a long rope tied around all of them, I don't know. But anyway, next slide. This is one of the good homes. The other thing he did was he created a fresh air program, and he brought children from Buffalo, from the city, into the park to live at Prospect Home. This house is still there in the park. It's near the administration building, and it's where our park director lives. And the Sisters of Mercy would bring their children and the orphans that would come from other orphanages in the city, and they would spend a week there. And just think, you get off the train, you walk under the railroad tracks, you go down this lane in the woods, and then you get on a stagecoach and you get driven through this beautiful park and up to this lovely home, and you're there with lots of good food and fresh air, and you even got to have lemonade and cookies with Mr. Letchworth at his home. So lots of children came and stayed, and he paid for all the railroad tickets. Oh, I forgot, they even got to ride on a railroad. So next slide. Now here's an example. These also are images that Mr. Letchworth used in his book that he wrote on the care and treatment of the mentally ill. And if you had someone at home who maybe had dementia or would wander into the woods and get lost or would attack people that he thought he didn't recognize, you might chain them to a log because you had to be out in the fields working. And you couldn't control them, and that was how you controlled them. You chained them to a log so they wouldn't run away. And this man, we actually, in our collection at the park, have a photograph of this man who arrived in a crate to a mental institution. And he was naked, and the crate, as you can see, had gaps between the boards, and everything just went down through. And then they would hose him down every once in a while to keep him clean. And he rode on the train in that crate, and his knees were bent up because they were too long for the box. And so when they took him out of the box, they were permanently bent, his knees. Next slide. There were worse things than that, actually. And for the chronically insane in this neighborhood, we had the Willard Asylum. And it was established in 1869 on Seneca Lake. And it was the best they could do. It was custodial care. They didn't have treatment, they didn't have pills, they didn't have medications or anything that they could really do for these people except take care of them and keep them safe. Asylum used to be a good word before it got stigmatized. It was a word for refuge, which is what everybody needs sometimes, as a place to be safe and calm and peaceful. So Willard is still there, but now it's a prison. Next slide, please. This is an example of the Allegheny County Poorhouse. This is the facade. Doesn't look too bad, looks very nice. And Mr. Letchworth went there, and his favorite story was that he went into the poorhouse and was examining everything, and he found bed bugs in the poorhouse. And so he went to the matron, the lady in charge, and he said, you have bed bugs in here, and we can't have that. You have to take care of that. You have to be more clean and take better care of things. And she just looked at him and said, we didn't have bed bugs till you came. Next slide. So the front looked good, but this is what nobody saw was the back. And it was just horrendous. His description of some of these places were just horrifying. And so he convinced the state of New York to fund institutions for the mentally ill, as well as nice, clean orphanages, and some people who did need the poorhouse, a decent place for them to go until they could get back on their feet. So he did a lot of good work. Next slide. This is a poorhouse that he designed himself, and he exhibited it at the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And he wasn't exactly a politically correct guy. Nobody was back then. The terminology that they used, we would be horrified at today, or maybe not. He would call the people in the mental institutions lunatics, and the people in the poorhouse. He said, we have to separate the sexes because otherwise we're breeding paupers. And he'd say things like that because I don't know if he did it for shock value or just because that's what the way he saw it. So the women were kept on one side, the men were kept on the other side, the administration building was in the middle, and that was the dining hall and some workrooms where they did different kinds of jobs. And that was a plan that he had for every town should have a decent place for people who really need some help right now. Next slide. And I think the crowning achievement of his life was Craig Colony. Have anybody here heard of Craig Colony? Craig Colony, the third project. His first project was the homeless children. The second project was the mentally ill, humane treatment for the mentally ill. And his third project was humane care for persons with epilepsy. Because then people thought that if you had epilepsy, you were mentally ill. And of course we know that's not true. You are ill, and some people with epilepsy also have mental illness, but it doesn't mean that you have both. So he wanted to create a place where these people would be with people like themselves. And so when they had a seizure, I wouldn't start screaming and run with my hands in the air and be afraid. Because they would be used to seeing that. They would know what was happening. And they were, because of these seizures, people stigmatized them, they called them witches and horrible things. So he created a village. This was a Shaker compound, and the Shakers had a huge place there. Frederick Law Olmsted designed grounds, and Mr. Letchworth was leaning over his shoulder telling him what to do because he wanted everything a certain way. He wanted to be in on every detail. The homes, the houses, next slide, the houses were beautiful. This was the ladies' parlor in the dormitory for young girls, the young ladies. They had a piano, they had a nice lamp to read by, and just everything pretty. And he wanted them to feel comfortable, and it was also supposed to be self-sustaining. They learned to be farmers, they learned to do woodworking, and all sorts of arts and crafts. They took care of their own laundry, so they were trained to do all these things. And at the same time, he got the one person in the country, Dr. Spratling, who was supposedly at that time was an expert on epilepsy. He got him to come and be there to keep track of their illnesses and get some kind of research about what can we do, what is causing this, try this, try that. So they had, it was a scientific experiment as well as a way for people to live and have a normal setting to live in. Next slide. These are the girls at Flag Day, And they had all kinds of activities for the young ladies. There was a train station nearby, so their families could easily come and visit them. Before Craig Colony, there were lots of places, well, not a lot, but some places like this throughout the country. But they were very expensive. They were only for people who could afford them. So this place was for everyone. Anybody with epilepsy, whether you were rich or poor, could come there and live sort of a normal life. Next. And what a beautiful room. This is the room where the girls did learn to sew and did sewing projects. And next slide, please. This is the boys' art class. I would love to have a classroom like that. Next slide. These are the boys going swimming. It wasn't all work and no play. And it also, you'll notice that there are several black children here, so it was not segregated like other things were at this time. It was for everybody. Next slide. These are the books that Mr. Letchworth wrote. The Insane in Foreign Countries, I forgot to mention, in 1880, on his own dime, he paid for himself to go on a fact-finding mission to Europe because he had been reading everything he could get his hands on about how they treated these problems in Europe, and he wanted to go and see how these things were working out. So he went over there and he visited reform schools, orphanages, mental institutions, and their charity homes, the poorhouses that they had over there, and got a lot of ideas that he brought back, and it didn't cost the taxpayer a dime. Next slide. He was also interested in history. This is Mr. Letchworth and a man named Menard, who was the local historian. This was a Seneca council house, and it was falling down. It was standing during the American Revolution and maybe before that. They were either going to burn it down or just take it apart and sell the parts. And Mr. Letchworth bought it. He bought the building and he numbered all the logs. Every piece of the building was numbered. And then they put it on a boat, and on the other side of the gorge at Letchworth Park is the remains of a canal. There used to be a canal there. They skidded that up the canal and parked it until the river froze over enough so they could move all that across. And they rebuilt it on the council grounds. Now, everybody who's been to Letchworth Park, have you been to the council grounds? Because the council grounds are kind of hidden. They don't mark it very well. It's a fabulous place to visit. Be sure and go there if you go back to the park. It's up on a hill. It overlooks his house. And in 2006, we put everything back. We moved some of the buildings, put everything back the way it was when Mr. Letchworth was there. And that was one of the things that he put there. Next slide, please. And that's the finished product. And there's his canoe. And this fellow here is a Native American, and he was the supervisor of putting this together because Mr. Letchworth wanted them to hold a conference, a special conference. In the American Revolution, the Mohawks were on the side of the British, and the Seneca were on the other side. Our side, I guess. And so they never got back together again. And so in 1872, I think it was, they all came together into this council house and they renewed their friendship and their brotherhood. And after they had all these ceremonies. President Fillmore was there and a few other dignitaries. And after they had this wonderful ceremony, that took all day, I think. They went down and knocked on Mr. Letchworth's door because he decided he should stay out of it. This was a special thing for the Native Americans. He didn't want to intrude. And they went down and knocked on his door and made him come outside. And the Indians were lined up in 2 rows in front of his front door. And they made him, for a minute he thought he had to run the gauntlet. They asked him to walk along, and he shook the hand of every Native American there. And then when he got to the end, they named him a member of the Wolf Clan, an honorary member of the Wolf Clan. And they named him Hiwaista. That was his Seneca name, and it means the man who always does right, which is very appropriate. So, next. How many of you have heard of Mary Jemison? So Mary Jemison was a captive. She was a white captive. She saw her whole family massacred in the French and Indian War, and she was taken by two Seneca women who had lost a brother in battle, and that was a custom they had. If you lose a family member in battle, you can just take another one from the white people. So they took her, and she had long red hair, so they thought she was really special. Well, she was only about 14 at the time, and she was raised by the Seneca. She married two Seneca warriors and outlived both of them. And she had 8 children. So when the white man came out to meet with the red man and divide up the land in western New York, they told Mary Jemison she could go back with her family. They had found her grandfather who was living in Virginia and 2 of her brothers who survived. And they told her she could go back and live with her family. And she said, no, I can't go back and live with my family because my children are my family and I have to stay with my children. So she could have gone back and lived a little bit of a life of leisure for a while, but she stayed with them and she lived a very hard life. And her book, she dictated her story of her life to a man in, I think it was 1824. And you can go to the library now and get a book and find out what the story of her life was. She had an amazing life. And so she was buried in the Indian burial ground in Buffalo. And people who heard her story were going to the cemetery and chipping off pieces of her tombstone. That's what's left of it right there. And the Seneca asked Mr. Letchworth if he would let her be buried on the council grounds. And she had every right to be buried there because she was given 18,000 acres of land. That was her reservation after the treaty was signed, the Treaty of Big Tree. And it was, most of it was in the park, in the north end of the park, in the Gargoyle area. So she had a right to be there. And Mr. Letchworth said, of course she can be buried here. And he paid for a very nice, he had her exhumed, bought a beautiful casket and a stone container for that, and had her buried. And now there's a beautiful statue where she's buried up on the council grounds. Absolutely gorgeous, by one of America's finest sculptors. So better get up there and see it someday. Next slide. Oh, there it is. That's a statue. It's by a man named Kirk Brown. It's a hyphenated last name. His last name is Kirk Brown, and he did a beautiful job on the statue. And in 1910, the year Mr. Letchworth died, that was unveiled at a special ceremony. Next slide. But of course, before he died, the state wanted to pick on him a little bit. So he found out that a law had been passed by the state of New York that they were going to build a dam 1,000 feet up from the upper falls, which is the falls that goes under the railroad tracks. They were going to build a dam. That meant that all the falls would be dried up through the gorge. So all the water would be held up there. And then sometimes it would trickle down if it overflowed. And he was horrified that they could do that. So he didn't know what to do, but he thought about it for a while, and he finally came up with an idea that the only way to save the falls and the gorge and the beauty of the gorge was to give his estate to the state of New York to be a gift to the people of New York as a public park. And he won. He finally won. But he had these printed and handed out all over the state of New York. These were an explanation of what was about to happen. And people wrote letters, and the newspapers carried all the stories. He was very clever because from day one he made a point of being friends with newspaper publishers. So he had them to count on. And so he saved the park and he gave it to us. And I hope you all go and visit it someday soon. Next slide. This is the way I like to end this. This is his statement about the importance of a park. In the development of a higher civilization, let us continue our efforts to preserve for the enjoyment and elevation of mankind those places in our land possessing rare natural beauty, the charms of which, once destroyed, can never be restored. And the night he died, he was writing by hand. He was trying to come up with an explanation of why something beautiful has value. That was what his last attempt was. So, that's my guy. Anybody have any questions? Nobody has asked me the question that I always get in the museum, which is, why didn't he get married? What was wrong with him?
Smart.
He used the same excuse that Susan B. Anthony did. His excuse was, and I think it was a perfectly acceptable one. He said, I have a mission, and if I'm going to fulfill that mission, I can't do that and be a good husband and a good father. He said, and Susan B. Anthony said the same thing. Even though she did get marriage proposals, she said, I can't get the vote for women and be somebody's wife. So, any questions though, other than that one? So my question is, when are you going to go to the park?
Where is tomorrow now?
Is
Well, we
Crane
should
the
do
name
a
of the
field trip
city?
next year.
Is Crane the name of the city, or where is what was the Crane compound?
The Craig Colony is in Saguenay, New York. If you've ever heard of that, it's down, it's south of the park, and it's near Bath, New York, not too far from Bath, New York, and Dansville. It's in there in that area. And Saguenay now it was an Indian name, I think, and now it's synonymous with jail, which Mr. Letchworth would not like to hear. What happened though is just like what happens anywhere in these institutions, and Mr. Letchworth, I think, realized this when he died. Somebody gets a little bit of power, or they can abuse power, and they take advantage. They're like in charge of this institution. Oh, nobody will know if I, take a couple of cases of tomatoes home tonight or something, whatever. And so people took advantage. People abused some of the persons who were in these institutions. And there's a place down on the Hudson River called Letchworth Village. And that was a place for persons who had epilepsy and mental illness. And they named it for Mr. Letchworth. He found out the year he died, they told him that this was happening. But Geraldo Rivera did an expose on that place, and they closed it down. And it was a gorgeous campus. They had it was like the kind of place Mr. Letchworth would have designed himself. There was a beautiful theater where they could put on plays and see plays. There was a bowling alley. The buildings were elegant, and it had just a beautiful campus. And now it's just a bunch of empty buildings, and they don't know what to do with them. So that Craig Colony, though, now is a jail, a prison. So, any other questions? Or is it time for cake?
One other. When was the Letchworth Inn developed as an inn? Do you know?
That happened after Mr. Letchworth's death. They opened it up as an inn and hotel. But one day, Mr. Letchworth let his grounds be open to the public. Anybody who wanted to come when he was living there could come. And one day somebody came and knocked on the door, and I don't know where the maid was, but the maid answered the door. And it was a couple, and they wanted to know when lunch was being served. And so the maid went into Mr. Letchworth and said, they want to know when lunch is being served. What shall I tell them? He said, tell them to come back at 1 o'clock. And they did, and he served them lunch. He didn't serve them, but they got lunch anyway. So it was it was after he died. He died in 1910. And after he died, they turned it into a restaurant and hotel.
But it is nice, and it's a wonderful place to stay.
Yeah, they did.
Why did he put a third floor of it?
He put the third floor in the house because so many people were coming in the park and looking in the windows up on the porch and everything that he couldn't focus. So he had to have a place up on the top to have a quiet room. Just like Josiah's house has the same thing over on Wasco Lake. He made a room upstairs to get away from the noise.
It looks like he accomplished his list very well.
He did.
Yes.
He really did. But I think he was kind of disillusioned in the end because he had so many good ideas and he tried so hard, but you can't control human nature. And one thing he did was he tried to get women administrators in most of these institutions. He felt that they did a better job than the men. I don't know why.
They were playing with their wood.
Right, and we're leaving the wood around.
He was